In part 3 of this series, I showcased the mods I made to get the weak links out of the autocross suspension on my 1992 Mustang GT. Those relatively inexpensive parts are designed to improve composure, corner entry, and move the limit of traction further out. This video covers my initial thoughts and install tips for those suspension upgrades. The Global West Del-A-Lum bushings are extremely well made. The tolerances are very tight, and you can see the quality and attention to detail in every piece. They come with clear instructions and a piece of angle iron that prevents the factory A-arms from crushing when removing the OEM bushings and installing the Global West bushings. I did have to grind the angle iron a bit to get it to fit into position. If you have a bushing removal tool like this one from Full Tilt Boogie Racing, you can get the OEM A-arm bushings and shells out by hand. But you will definitely need a press to properly install the Global West shells. It's really important to make sure the Global West bushing shells are going in straight when pressing them in. The shells should end up sitting flush against the face of the A-arm. Pay attention to where the grease fittings will end up. You need to have easy access to them after installing the shells. Use waterproof grease on the sleeves, the shells, and anywhere the Delrin bushings touch metal. The offset bushings go in specific locations as indicated in the instructions. You will probably have to use parts of the bushing removal tool to create some space between the mounting tabs on the K-member in order to fit the new bushings in place. And it's a good idea to grind the areas where the bushings made up to the K-member smooth. But when you're done, the Global West Del-A-Lum bushings will fit into position with no gaps. Not including the time it took to have the shells pressed in, the Global West Del-A-Lum bushings take about 7 hours to install. You will need an alignment after installing the bushings. The Global West Delrin steering rack bushings are designed to fit perfectly into place. They come with simple instructions. On my Fox, the steering rack bushing sleeves can come out without disconnecting the steering shaft from the rack, but that might not be true for all cars. You want to make sure to clean the inside of the steering rack bushing mount holes and clean the sleeves. It's a good idea to test fit the Delrin bushings on your sleeves. Sometimes the front edges of the sleeves will need to be filed down because they get warped over time. Check the steering rack bolt washers for sharp burrs that might cut into the Delrin. You should grind those smooth. I used a little waterproof grease to help the bushing slide into place, but it's not called for in the instructions. The Global West Delrin steering rack bushings took an hour and a half to install. The Steeda Delrin sway bar bushings are designed for a precise fit. They will not work with the OEM sway bar brackets. You need to have Steeda aluminum sway bar mounts. They don't come with instructions, but the install is pretty straightforward. Just make sure you lube them well with the supplied grease anywhere the bushings touch metal. If you're using an older sway bar, there's a chance it might not work with the Steeda Delrin bushings, but I can tell you for sure that these bushings fit perfectly with the current version of the Steeda 1 3/8 inch sway bar. If you purchase a Steeda 1 3/8 inch front sway bar, you'll get a very well-built, powder-coated part that comes with new poly end-link bushings, poly sway bar bushings, and steering rack limiters. If you're doing this job yourself, it can be helpful to zip tie the sway bar up into position or support it with jack stands. It's really important that the sway bar is rotated to allow the end links to be installed in the A-arms before you torque the mount bolts. These bushings eliminate all slop, and when tightened down, you won't be able to rotate the sway bar by hand. You always want to tighten the sway bar end links with the suspension under load. The Steeda Delrin sway bar bushings took about an hour and a half to install. The Steeda spring spacers are essentially a couple of giant steel washers. They don't come with instructions. I used some 3M tape to stick them to the spring perches to make the install easier. Using the Steeda spring spacers will make it harder to reinstall your springs, especially if you have poly spring isolators. I used electrical tape to secure the top isolator in place. I also used Maximum Motorsports spring installation tool. If you're installing lowering springs into your OEM A-arms, this simple tool works incredibly well. It holds the bottom spring coil in place as you jack up on the A-arm. That helps prevent the spring from popping out. You want to take every possible precaution anytime you're removing or installing your springs. A compressed spring can fly out and seriously injure you. I installed the Steeda spring spacers along with other mods, but I estimate doing them by themselves would take about 2 hours. The J&M Spherical upper axle bushing kit is very well engineered. It's shipped with the spherical bushings tight, so don't be alarmed that you can't articulate them by hand. They come with simple instructions, but you can also find a very good install video on Late Model Restoration's website. You will need a bushing removal tool to get the OEM bushings and shells out of the axle. Removing these bushings with the rear end in the car means working in a tight space. Maximum Motorsports makes this tool specifically for the upper axle bushings, and it works really well. Once the OEM shells are removed, clean the inside of the holes and make sure there are no barbs to prevent the new bushings from sliding into place. I put the J&M spherical bushings in the freezer overnight, put some anti-seize on the outside edge, and they popped into place with almost no effort. You'll want to use some blue Loctite on the threads to keep the retaining nut from backing off. This nut doesn't need to be extremely tight. The instructions call for 20 foot-pounds. It is hard to get a tool on the retaining nut without marring the edges, so go slow and be gentle. Whenever you disconnect your upper control arms, the rear end will rotate out of position. It can be hard to align the upper control arms with the bushings. I've found that using a jack under the dog bone beneath the pumpkin makes it easier to raise the rear end into the correct position. You might also have to lift up on one side of the axle to get things to align perfectly. If your rear brake lines are attached to the pumpkin, you'll want to unbolt the bracket so you don't pull too hard on the rear center brake line as you lower the axle. This is a relatively simple install, but you're working in a cramped space with parts that have to line up well to go back together. Your installation time may vary depending on how hard it is to get your OEM bushings out, how much cleaning the holes need, and how difficult it is to align the upper control arms with the new bushings. The J&M Spherical upper axle bushing kit took me about 2 hours to install. The Global West Del-A-Lum A-arm bushings and Delrin steering rack bushings, Steeda Delrin sway bar bushings, and spring spacers, and the J&M upper axle bushing kit take about 14 hours to install. If you're working on an old Fox body, you might find some bad tie rods, torn spring isolators, and deteriorated shock bushings along the way. So it's a good idea to inspect everything while you've got the car apart. And having the right tools makes all the difference when you're getting the bushing shells out and putting the springs in. A reliable jack, a good torque wrench, and a second set of hands will also make all these installs easier. I'll post my review of how these parts hold up under autocross conditions after the season starts.